All right, so here we go. In Canada, in the northwest section of Canada, is the aptly named Northwest Territories. It's like this big chunk of really just like wild land. I mean, it's forests, it's mountains, it's rivers, it's streams. It's like this just pristine bit of nature. It's massive. I want to say it's like hundreds of thousands of acres. It might even be millions of acres, but it's huge, this massive, massive thing. In fact, to give some scope or to give you a sense of just how big it is, it's 4 times the size of Germany. And another aspect of the Northwest Territories is that pretty much nobody lives there. It's like this humongous place, but really nobody lives there. So again, Germany is 4 times smaller than the Northwest Territories, but Germany is home to 83-ish million people. The Northwest Territories are home to a total of 50,000 people. It is like this remote wilderness, okay? It's like truly rugged. But within the Northwest Territories, pretty much at the heart of the Northwest Territories, is this 10,000 square mile valley called the Nahanni Valley. And I was so fascinated when I first read about the Nahanni Valley, not even about the lore that I'm going to get into or the stories that sort of followed, but like we think about the earth as being a place that's basically been discovered. You know, every square inch of the planet has been looked at by somebody at some point. That's sort of the feeling that likely we all have today. Like it'd be very unusual if there were parts of the world that like nobody had seen before. That just seems crazy. I mean, maybe in the ocean or something, but on land, it sort of feels like we've covered it all. The Nahanni Valley might be one of the very last large places in the world that there are genuinely spots that no person has ever seen. So the Northwest Territory, lots of people go in there, but the Nahanni Valley, it's really unique because the Nahanni Valley is so hard to get to. So you can get into the Northwest Territories. I mean, it's a rugged place, but you can maneuver in the Northwest Territories by road, I think there's a train, there's planes, you name it, but the Nahanni Valley, it's nearly impossible to get into, at least most of it. Basically, it requires like an arduous overland hike, which is perilous. There's no really any trail markers or anything. It's like a very difficult place to get to. You can fly there, but not really directly. You have to land, I think a floater plane has to land like offset, and again, arduous journey in. There's actually a crazy video from like the 1970s of this guy who, the way he would get into the Nahanni Valley, he's like this old like miserly guy who was like a recluse, and he filmed himself, again, in like the 1970s. He would take like 10 pieces of lumber, this like old, like strong looking guy, and he'd bring an outboard motor, and he would like one by one haul these pieces of wood and the outboard motor to the base of this waterfall, and he would climb up each piece to the top of the waterfall, and then he'd assemble a boat, and he would putt his way on this boat up the river to the next waterfall, where he'd disassemble the boat, carry it up the waterfall, build it back together again like 3-4 times. Like you have to climb waterfalls and take a boat, a DIY boat, into the valley to get there. So because the Nahanni Valley is just so inaccessible, also caveat, the Nahanni Valley is it is a national park. So Canada has dubbed it is a national park. But don't let that fool you. It doesn't mean, oh, tourists, come check out Nahanni Valley. There's no tourist accommodations. There's really nothing there. It's a place that is now sort of protected, and we'll get into the weirdness around what they chose to protect at the end of the story. So when you look it up, it's a national park. Oh, it's so beautiful. Yeah, but no one can get into it, right? So because of its isolation and how difficult it is to get into this place, for the last 10,000 years, really the only people that we're aware of that have attempted to stay in the valley long term are native tribes. In particular, there was one tribe known as the Naha tribe. I forget when they were there, but this is many, many years ago, hundreds of years ago. However, as I discovered in doing some research about the Nahanni Valley, in the 1900s, some really strange things started happening in the Nahanni Valley that, depending on how you interpret these things, seem to give credibility to the idea that there is something going on inside of this wild territory that we can't explain. So in 1904, there were these three brothers, Willie, Frank, and Charlie. Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod. And they were gold prospectors. And in 1904, and they lived in the Northwest Territories. They lived sort of not far from the Nahanni Valley, but certainly not in it. They, like many other people who lived in that area, were certainly aware of the lore surrounding the Nahanni Valley. It was sort of like this almost off-limits place. But in virtue of being gold prospectors, they viewed a place like the Nahanni Valley as like potentially a treasure trove. I mean, if people are either unable or too scared or both to get into this beautiful, like pristine bit of nature, I mean, there's sure to be gold in there. And so Willie, Frank, and Charlie, they decide, you know what? Despite, what people say about, how dangerous or how kind of, scary this place is, we're going to try our hand. We're going to go into the Nahanni Valley and we're going to see if we can find some gold. And so they pack up their supplies and they head out. They tell their families what they're doing. These are, three, experienced gold prospectors. It was not totally unusual to carry out such an extreme expedition. But into the valley they go. And as I mentioned before, like there are ways into the valley. It's just hard. They elected to do the boating route, which I would imagine, considering the video I mentioned earlier of the guy who had to build and disassemble and rebuild his boat, based on the way they described their journey, I think they were doing that. They literally had timber, as they described it, and they would fashion their boat, and they would make their way up the river, and then they would presumably climb several waterfalls before eventually, we know, they reached what's called the Flat River, which is sort of ironically named because it's anything but flat. The Flat River is like this, it's the main waterway that cuts through the Nahanni Valley. And it's effectively a rapid. I mean, at certain points, not the whole thing, but it's not a smooth, you want to shut the door, it's getting a little noisy. It's not like a smooth area. It needs to be, so think of like a rapid, that's the gist. So they're on the Flat River and they're making their way through this gorgeous valley, and eventually they see there's like this shoreline, this little, not beachhead, but it's like a little bit of a shoreline, and they pull their boat off. They get out, and it's like, picture just like mountains off in the distance, and there's forest everywhere. It's this, very intense but beautiful river, and they pull off, and they beach their boat, and they pull out their sluices, which are the devices you use to, you basically, you grab the sediment in the river and you have like a little sifter in your sluice. It's like a strainer, and you let all the small stuff fall through, and then the idea is the strainer catches anything that could be gold. And so they start sluicing, looking for gold in this riverbed, this sort of random riverbed, and they find so much gold. It's like unbelievable. It's like the whole riverbed is just covered in gold. And so they're having just this unbelievable run here. This was the best decision we could have made. And so all day until it gets dark, they are out in the water, sluicing away, getting their gold. And then finally, actually they stay through the night. The next day, they continue collecting gold until finally they had collected so much gold, they actually didn't have the ability to carry anymore. And so they needed to leave, like just to sell all the gold, and then they planned to come back. And so they get back in their boat with all their gold and all their supplies, and they start making their way back along the Flat River, back, to go home. But unfortunately, as they're, making their way, the river got rough, and they capsized, and they lost all their gold, a lot of their supplies. Their boat actually broke up. I mean, it was like this disastrous thing. The three men were able to grab their rifles and they lost quite a bit of supplies, but they got the main stuff. They grabbed some timber from the boat. They pulled it to the beach, and there was no way to get the gold that they had lost. It sunk to the bottom. It was too rough out there to try to get it. So it's like very disappointing. But the guys, they're sort of resigned to the fact that you can't do anything about it. But there's clearly lots of gold here, like this is a setback, but we can definitely find more. So they get to shore again, same spot they had been, where they knew there was still gold, and they set up their tent and they sort of like reconvene, and then the next day they get up early and they start sluicing again. But this time they have no luck. it's like all the gold was just gone. And, despite spending the entire day, they didn't find any gold. It was just like all of it was gone. And so they stayed for a couple more days, but based on their supplies and the fact that they had lost quite a few supplies when their boat capsized, they decided that, basically count our win here, that we survived and we know there's gold here. Yeah, it was bad that we didn't get any more gold the second time, but let's go back home, let's reconvene, and we'll come back out here. And so they pack up, and this time they successfully exit the valley. Now, when they get back, the two younger brothers, so Willie and Frank, they're completely motivated to go back into the valley basically as soon as they can, which was not going to be an immediate turnaround. It was going to be, a couple of months. But the oldest brother, Charlie, he's just like, he's having some second thoughts. By the time he gets back, he's like, man, that was really close. Like, we're lucky all we did was lose some supplies and gold. We could have died out there. I mean, who's going to come, who's going to come save us? And so Charlie ultimately says, you know what, I don't want to go. I don't want to go back. I know that you guys will probably find a whole bunch of gold. Good for you, but I'm good. I'm going to stay here. And so Willie and Frank, they're disappointed, but they're like, fine. And so they begin putting together their own expedition. They recruit a friend, a guy whose name is Robert Weir, to replace Charlie. And the three of them, after a couple of months, they have all the supplies they need, and they head back into the valley. Now, when they left, this is like the end of 1904, early 1905, everybody in their town knew they were going. Charlie, having been in the valley, knew firsthand the possibility that there could be quite a bit of gold. And the expedition, Willie, Frank, and Robert, they didn't give a definitive time they would come back. And remember, this is 1904, 1905. They were just going out into the wilderness, and it's sort of like, we'll be back when we're back. We can't send word, really, so you just gotta wait for us. But the general expectation was they were going to go out there, and if they found gold, they would stay for quite some time, maybe a whole summer or maybe a year, who knows. And so they head off into the wilderness, and nobody hears from them. There's no word sent back. It's, weeks go by, months go by, nobody hears from them. But Charlie, the oldest brother who opted not to go back, despite his reservations about going in, he actually was the one telling, the family and friends, like, hey, it's fine. They know what they're doing. I was out there with them. It's not as bad as everybody thinks it is out there. Yeah, Flat River's pretty bad, but they're going to be fine. And so he's telling people not to worry. But a year ultimately passes, and still, people in town are like, man, they still haven't come back. They haven't sent word. Like, should we go in looking for them? And Charlie's like, I'm sure they're fine. They know what they're doing. Another year goes by. So now it's been 2 years. 2 years since the men had stepped off for this second trip. So it's like 1907. And at that point, when still they haven't heard from the brothers or from Robert, Charlie, the oldest, is finally like, okay, obviously, I have to go look for them because clearly something's up. This is not normal. So Charlie, along with 4 men, they mount this search party and they go into Nahanni Valley. And they, again, take the waterway. And he's aiming for the same beachhead. It's not really a beach. It's like a little shoreline off the side of the river. He's aiming for that spot because he knows that's where he and his brothers had been when he went 2 years earlier. And so he gets into the Flat River, and he gets to that point where he can clearly tell he's definitely in the vicinity of where they had been before. But he doesn't see his brothers, he doesn't see Robert. And so he continues, sorry, got a nice thing in my throat right now. And so he continues following this river past the beachhead, the shoreline, and he reaches this part where he decides to make a turn. And there's actually a turn in the river called the Big Bend. And it's this really sharp, almost like 45-degree turn that's pretty violent when you make this turn. The water's pretty rough. But once you make that turn, it dumps you into what's called Second Canyon. And so they make this turn. And if there was ever a time for you to just take a note to Google something later, it's this. Because the images of this are just unbelievable, okay? Within the Nahanni Valley, there are 4 distinct canyons. There's more than that, but there's these 4 canyons that Flat River actually cuts through, or one of the estuaries that pulls off the Flat River. So it's First Canyon, Second Canyon, Third Canyon, and Fourth Canyon. And Second Canyon is a 10-mile stretch where the river, Flat River, goes right in between this just unbelievably huge canyon. It's about 3,000 feet at its high point on either side. And also the depth of the river at this point is equally deep. It's like thousands of feet deep. And also in Second Canyon, the walls of the canyon are so tight to the water and they're so sheer that there is no beachhead. I keep saying beachhead. There's no shoreline. There's no place to land. So once you make the turn from in Big Bend and you're in Second Canyon, you have a 10-mile stretch of being in this very claustrophobic, like walled in, massive valley here, the canyon, where you have to get to the end. There's nowhere to go. But what makes it even, this is the Googling part, what makes it just really eerie is there's wind that cuts through these canyons. So there's 4 canyons. I was saying there's 4 canyons. They all pretty much look like this, but Second Canyon is the most pronounced. There's wind that cuts through the canyon that makes almost like a whistling sound. But on top of that, on the sheer cliffs, the thousands of feet up on either side, there are all these openings to caves that clearly are deep cave systems. And we know because some of the ones that are lower on the cliff face, previous explorers have climbed into because they're accessible. And they go deep into these mountains. Like they're just these massive tunnel systems. But there are these tunnels that are like halfway up the canyon wall that nobody can get to unless, you're like a free climber or something and you climb up to it. But like these are cave openings, hundreds of them that people have not gone inside of. And so the wind cuts through this canyon and it whistles and it picks up all these openings of the caves and it makes almost like a wailing sound inside of this canyon. And also the weather system creates quite a bit of fog inside of this canyon. So Second Canyon is like a terrifying place to be. And so they go from sort of like sunny, beautiful, like, whatever, just beautiful nature out on Flat River. And then you make that turn on Big Bend and you're in like the setting of a horror movie. And so they make this turn and they're in Second Canyon. And Second Canyon basically feeds into the next canyon, which is 10 miles away. But at that point, it opens up and there's a little bit more in the way of places you can beach your boat if you need to, but it's still sheer cliffs everywhere. And so the Charlie and the search party, they're in this very bizarre Second Canyon. They're looking up at like the cave openings and they're feeling like they're being watched the whole time. They would later say that there was this intense feeling of just eyes were on them. And they make their way finally. They don't see any sign of the brothers. They've not been spotted. And they get to the end of Second Canyon, which is denoted by the wind letting up, the fog sort of letting up. And again, it kind of opens up a little bit and you can land on little bits of shoreline. And pretty much as soon as they come out of Second Canyon and they see these bits of shoreline, they spot up ahead on one of these bits of little shoreline a tent, like a very obvious man-made tent. And so, Charlie and the search party, they're like, go over there, go over there. And so they get to the shoreline, they get off, and they're yelling out for the brothers, but they can't see anybody yet. And it is forested behind them, but it sort of feeds into a cliff that shoots straight up. This is like a little landing site. And as they get closer to the tent, which is a little bit back from the water, and it's behind some trees as well, they see there's a body on the ground. And it appears to be a man, and he's lying with his torso down. And he's lying in such a way that his arm is reaching out, like he was reaching for something when he died. And just beyond his fingertips is a rifle that's propped up against a tree. And so they see this dead guy, and then they go around to the tent because the opening to the tent was on the backside, and half in the tent, half out of the tent, also lying on their torso, is another body. And both of these men were missing their heads, so they're beheaded. They don't find anything else there other than an etching into a tree, basically right where that rifle was propped. Carved into the tree were the words, "We have found a fine prospect." And if you think about gold prospecting, it sort of seems like this is a message that they had found gold. They searched the campsite, and even though they couldn't find the heads are gone, and they couldn't figure out who these guys were, but based on personal effects, Charlie was able to figure out that these were actually his brothers. His brothers were the two dead bodies. But Robert Weir was nowhere to be found, or let's just say a third body was not there. And so, Charlie is not shocked, but devastated that he clearly has lost his brothers. They see that etching in the tree and they're thinking, okay, it sort of tracks with why they came in here. They found gold, but they searched all their belongings and there was no gold. Nowhere, like not in their belongings. They even sluiced the nearby riverbank and there was no gold. And so it was just a little bit confusing that there was this message on the tree. And also it was a little bit ominous that one of the two brothers was clearly reaching for his gun, at death. And the other brother appeared to have been like leaping out of his tent when he died. And again, they're both missing their heads. And so Charlie and the search party, after gathering up what they could, they ended up leaving the valley. And when they left the Nahanni Valley, they told the mounted police about what they found. And the police actually went in and did a full-scale investigation to see what happened. And they actually did find another body. It was never officially attributed to Robert Weir, but not that far away, but a little bit down the river, they found a skeleton that was also missing its head that was sort of half in the river. It's hard to tell what happened to this person, and there was no way to tell whose body it belonged to. But a lot of folks believe that's Robert Weir, but the police said, no, like there's no way that's Robert Weir. What happened here is these men, Willie and Frank anyways, died of starvation. And, the reason they're missing their heads is because of just animal predation. Like that's all this was. Now, Charlie, the brother, the surviving brother, when he found out that was the ruling, or that was the decision, that was the result of the investigation, he was pretty upset about it. And he's like, I don't believe that. From the looks of it, it really seemed like they were attacked by something, by someone. But that was ultimately the decision that was made by the police. It's just, this is natural. Now, when that investigation wrapped up, it actually sort of like made the news and it sort of went viral, if you will, in 1907. Certainly within at least the Northwest Territories. Lots of people found out about this story. They found out like, that's so crazy. There was all this lore surrounding this valley to begin with. And now we have these men who are so rugged and knew what they were doing being found dead and missing their heads inside of the valley. Like that's a crazy story. And so that section of the Nahanni Valley, that second canyon right up until where the bodies were found, was sort of dubbed the Headless Valley from here on out. And so if you look up the Headless Valley, you'll see pictures of that canyon and that landing site. So nothing really happens beyond, in terms of Charlie, he does not pursue further investigations. He always believed there was more to the story than the police were letting on. So fast forward to 1913. So now it's 6 years later. It's important to note that generally speaking, people were not keen to go into the Nahanni Valley, or certainly not the Headless Valley, even before what happened to the McLeod brothers and very likely Robert Weir. But because of the virality of that story, it really stemmed people from going into the valley. Even though now it was like pretty obviously there is gold in there. I mean, that was also a big part of the story, is that there's gold in there if you're gutsy enough to go. And but no one went in. It was just one of those things where people totally avoided the valley like the plague at this point. But in 1913, a man named Martin Jorgensen, who was also a gold prospector, he decided that, no one's going in there and I bet there's gold. I'm not just gonna, let it sit there. I'm tough enough, I'm brave enough. I'm gonna go in there and I'm gonna see if I can find some gold. And so by himself, he overland hikes his way into the valley, and he ultimately sets up camp, actually not camp, he ultimately builds a cabin, a one-room cabin about 70 miles away from the Headless Valley, from where the McLeod brothers and Robert Weir were. He builds up this cabin, and his plan is, I'm gonna stay in the valley for a whole year, and I'm just gonna, pool as much gold as I can, make a fortune, and I'll be so glad I did it. And so he, when he gets into the valley, we know that he did find gold very quickly, because after he got set up, he was able to, I'm not exactly sure how he did this, so Forgive me, I don't really understand the communication method, but we know Martin Jorgensen sent word to his partners. He had some partners that were, maybe they invested in the trip that he went on, maybe they bought his equipment, I'm not really sure, but his partners in this gold finding scheme, he sent word to them and said, I've struck it rich. I've found gold and I will meet you in a year at this particular spot that they had designated that was sort of right outside the valley. It was going to be during the warmer months and they would meet him there and they'd all be rich. It was going to be great. However, when the year ended and it was time for the partners to literally go to the spot and meet with Martin and celebrate their victory together and whatever, Martin did not make it to the rendezvous point. He didn't show up. And because the partners had at least that time and maybe one other time had been in touch with him, they had no reason to suspect that there was anything wrong with him. So it just felt really uncharacteristic that he wouldn't be here. And so, but they were ready for this. They figured if he didn't show up, they would just go in because they actually knew where his cabin was. He had put in one of his correspondences how to get to his cabin from the rendezvous point. And so the partners, they follow this trail into the Nahanni Valley and they ultimately find the cabin, or what was left of the cabin. The cabin was completely burned to the ground, like completely ashes on the ground. And lying on the ground next to the burned out cabin was the headless body of Martin Jorgensen. There was no gold anywhere near him. There was no gold in the riverbanks. There was all of his supplies. There was no gold anywhere. It was just a dead man without his head next to a burned out cabin. And the partners, they left, they went and they told the mounted police, who went out, they did an investigation, and they ultimately said, well, what we think happened is Martin must have been doing something with the stovepipes, and it lit the place on fire. And then after he was dead, there was some level of animal predation, which is why he's missing his head. However, I'm saying this without a whole lot of absolute knowledge on this, but my understanding about animal predation is that it isn't like they only rip your head off and don't touch any other part of your body. Like if an animal is beginning to predate you, or whatever the word is, to eat you, it's going to be more than just your head. But it was just his head, and they never found his head. Fast forward again. So by the way, the police, they basically say, this is all natural. Just he basically burned the place down and animals bit his head off. So then fast forward again, 8 years. So now we're in 1921. And another gold prospector, a guy named John O'Brien, along with a partner who is unnamed, they decide to go into the valley as well. They have obviously heard the stories of what's happened to Martin Jorgensen, what happened to the McLeod brothers, but they feel like, you know what, someone's going to come out of here with gold. Why not us? And so into the valley they went. We don't know exactly how they got into the valley. There's only a couple of ways, but they wound up setting up camp relatively close to the Headless Valley. So where the McLeod brothers and Robert Weir were found, near that second canyon. And they also sent word out, basically right after they had gotten there. I'm not sure who they sent it to, but they sent word out saying that they found gold and they're going to stay here for an extended period of time. And so they have several days where, things are just going great. They're journaling, saying how, wow, we're going to be so rich. This is so awesome. They're sluicing all this gold. And then at a certain point, and it's not really clear when this happens, but it probably was in the first couple of weeks of them being there. They had also, in addition to collecting gold, they needed food, and they had set up traps, animal traps around the area. And John O'Brien tells his partner, the other guy he was there with, that he was going to go and check the traps. So this is just sort of like a routine thing in the middle of the day. And the partner's like, okay, cool. But the way this worked is it was not going to be like, I'll be back in 5 minutes. It was going to take him like 8 or 9 days to actually effectively check every single trap because they had set them as they made their way in. So these are sort of spaced out. But they needed the food, so he was going to go do that. So it's like, hey, I'll see you in 8 or 9 days. And so John O'Brien leaves. Well, 8 or 9 days goes by, and O'Brien doesn't return. And so the partner at this point starts to get worried. And it just so happened there was another unnamed gold prospector that was in the area at the time. They're like the only prospectors in the valley. They just happened to see each other, so they start talking and they're interacting. And the partner of John O'Brien enlists the help of this other guy. And he's like, hey, my guy John, he's gone. I got to go look for him. Will you come with me? And they're like, all right. So they start walking in the direction of these traps. You know, they know it's going to be quite a bit of a journey to find them all, but really not that far from their camp. They come to this clearing, and picture this. It's getting dark by the time they found him, because at first they didn't know what they were looking at. They're walking through this uncharted wilderness. It's dark out. They're calling for John, and ahead of them is like this clearing. And there's a log that's laying on the ground, and there's clearly somebody, or what looks like somebody, sitting on the log with their back turned to to the partner and the other guy. And they see it, and they're calling out like, "John, is that you? Is that you?" You know, he's 100 yards away. You know, there's enough light coming down from the moon. They can basically see something sitting on the log. But they end up walking closer and closer, and they can tell now as they get much closer that this is definitely a person who's sitting just on this log. And they go around when they reach this person, and they look, and it's John O'Brien. And he's not missing his head, but he's sitting on this log, and there's this burned out fire right in front of him on the ground, like it had been lit at some point and it had burned out. And he's holding a matchbook in his hand. And he just has this neutral expression on his face, and he's just sitting there, or he's just sitting on the log, and he's dead. He's frozen to death. But it wasn't really even that cold, but he's frozen to death, literally frozen in position. And so the partner and the other guy, they're so startled by what they see that they bolt and they gather up their things, they flee the valley, they get police to come out, police find John O'Brien, and they would write in their report that this was really unusual. They would actually say that it almost looked like John O'Brien was flash frozen, that he didn't even see it coming, that he was just sitting there and like immediately was frozen to death, which is why he's just like not even reacting, sitting there with his matchbook in hand. And so John O'Brien, he dies. And so by this point, the police are beginning to field questions that it's like, hey, it kind of seems like every few years, people go into the valley and they die under really mysterious circumstances. Maybe there's a connection here. Maybe these cases are all connected, but the police are like, no way, everything's totally normal out in the valley. But people by this point, after the John O'Brien case, because it wasn't headless, it was like flash frozen, it was weird enough that people genuinely believed that the Nahanni Valley and the Headless Valley, really, which is the same place, were truly haunted. That became the belief, at least in the Northwest Territories. Fast forward to arguably the creepiest anecdote of this whole story is in 1926. This is 5 years after John O'Brien is found frozen. So 5 years later, 1926, and there's this hunting party that had gone into the valley to go hunting. And they believed, we have strength in numbers. There was quite a few of them. I don't know how many. It sounded like there was at least a dozen people. This was like a very expensive hunting party. You had to pay a lot of money to be led in here because this is like not really an easy place to get to. It's very dangerous. And so, the leader of the group was very experienced. And so this is like a premium hunting party. They come out and they make camp not far from where the McLeod brothers were, so near the Headless Valley. And they're out hunting for the day, and they come back and they set up their campsite along the river. And it's a normal night. Everyone's laughing and telling stories and eating by the fire. There's no fear, no nothing. Everything's fine. But the next morning when they wake up, one of the members of the hunting party is gone. This young woman named Annie Lafferty. She was just gone. And there was no reason for it. Nobody had heard her leave. Nobody had seen anything. She was just gone. And there wasn't anywhere to go. I mean, you could go off into the wilderness, but there was no reason to. And so the hunting party was, they knew the stories about this place, and this felt bad. And so that day, when they woke up and discovered this, they spent the whole day looking for Annie, but they never found her. They did not find Annie. And eventually the hunting party left the valley, they told the police, and now there was actually a very significant search. They came into the valley and they combed the valley for Annie Lafferty. She came from, I believe, a pretty wealthy family. And there was a very serious effort to find her, but no trace of her was found. Like, she completely vanishes. A couple of months after Annie Lafferty had gone missing, there's this guy named Charlie, not Charlie, the brother of the McLeod brothers, is a different Charlie, and he's in a bar. And he's in the Northwest Territories. He's in a bar, and he's a solo guy. He's sort of like a keeps to himself guy, a loner, outdoorsman. And He's sitting in a bar and he overhears some men talking about Annie Lafferty. And Charlie does not know who Annie Lafferty is. But he hears the details of what they're saying and he realizes, wait a minute, I think I know something about what happened to her. So Charlie, he happened to be in the Nahanni Valley at the same time as that hunting party. Because as much as I've made it seem like nobody goes into the valley, people did go into the valley. It was just like literally a handful at a time at most. And oftentimes years would go by and nobody went in at all. But periodically, like we saw with the John O'Brien case and with this hunting party, there was some level of overlap. It was rare, but it did happen. Charlie was in the valley relatively near the hunting party because he could hear them and he sort of maneuvered himself to be closer to them. And it's unclear why he was in the valley at all. I think he was a gold prospector, but all we know is he was definitely there and he was by himself. And on the night that Annie went missing, Charlie, well, actually, let me tell you how he got to telling the story. So he's in the bar and he overhears these guys telling the story of what happened to Annie, how she disappeared. They gave the date that she went missing. And Charlie was like, oh my gosh, I know something. And he goes to the police and he says, here's what happened to me. I was out there and this is what I saw. So this is what he told the police. He said, on that night when, this woman Annie went missing, I was by myself. It was nighttime and I couldn't sleep. And so I got out of my tent and he's relatively near the river. And so you can hear the sound of the river kind of gently flowing by. This was a section of the Flat River that was not particularly violent. And he's just sort of like, killing time until he feels tired. And as he's just kind of sitting around, he starts hearing what sounds like rocks landing in the water. Not big rocks, but like small, medium-sized rocks, like splashing in the water. Like imagine taking a rock yourself and throwing it, the sound it would make. So there's these little splashes that are sort of sporadic that just called his attention to them because he's thinking that's not natural. Something is doing that. Something is making those sounds. And so he's aware the hunting party is sort of generally over there, down the shore a little bit. And that's roughly where he's hearing these sounds, but it's all echoing off the canyon walls. So he can't really tell where it's coming from, but it's broadly speaking coming from where the hunting party is. And so he begins walking towards the water, like just straight towards the water because the trees on the mainland sort of blocked his view from where he thinks he sees the sound. He goes to the shoreline and it's the middle of the night, but there's a very bright moon that's casting quite a bit of light on the river. He gets to the edge of the river and he looks down in the direction of the hunting party. They're quite a bit away. But he looks in that direction and you have to picture from his perspective, you have the river over here and here's the land and he's looking right alongside it. And the terrain kind of rose up, like the shoreline itself sort of went up at a rise and then sort of disappeared down the backside. And the hunting party was sitting on the shoreline right in front of that rise. And so he's looking in the direction of this hunting party and he sees what's making the splashing sounds. Illuminated by the moonlight is this Caucasian woman who is completely naked and she's running, scrambling on all fours up this rise, like a coyote, like going to a ridgeline to howl. She's galloping up this ridgeline, and with every step she's taking, she's knocking stones into the river. That's the sound he's hearing, and he's staring at her, and all these thoughts are going through his head. Like, you can't go into the wild here naked for any reason. You're gonna die out there, so there's no reason at all she should be doing this, let alone how bizarre she was moving. He actually would tell the police that I assumed she was possessed. But what really sealed the deal for him is as she made it to the top of this rise, she turned and appeared to look right back at Charlie. And he said her face was distorted and her eyes, they looked totally possessed. He was terrified. And he sort of stumbled back and went back into the tree line as she vanished up over the ridge and was gone. When he told the police this story, they didn't know what to make of it, but they showed him a picture of Annie Lafferty. And he was like, that is who I saw. Annie Lafferty. That's the woman that was running on all fours naked up over the ridgeline. They never found Annie Lafferty though. She was gone. So after the Annie Lafferty event, 5 years later in 1931, by the way, like this is just adding to the lore of the valley. The police basically were not willing to accept that Charlie's story oh, like that's what happened. They sort of were like, she vanished, an animal grabbed her, who knows? Those stories, they never got put together, but if you read enough, you hear about this testimony from Charlie. So fast forward 5 years from that, and you have a guy named Phil Powers, who was a gold prospector, who went off by himself to find some gold. He overlooks all the dangers of the valley. He goes in. He also builds a one-story cabin for himself. And, word gets out that he sends out that he's found gold, but then he doesn't come back when he's supposed to come back. Search party goes out and they find his cabin and it's burned to the ground, just like Martin Jorgensen, except Phil Powers was inside of his cabin. So he died because he was inside of the cabin that burned to the ground. And it's obvious that he died from that. However, they did an investigation into the fire. And they discovered, without a doubt, that the fire started somehow on the roof. And it basically suggests that Phil Powers would have had ample time to get out of his cabin before it burned to the ground. And so it largely suggests he was dead in his cabin by the time the fire started. We don't know what killed him, though, because his body was so destroyed. The next is in 1936, so 5 years after that, William Epler and Joseph Mulholland, other gold prospectors, they go into Nahanni Valley, they go missing. The search party goes out, they find their cabin as well. It is not burned to the ground. I'm sorry, no. It is also burned to the ground, but there are no bodies. So these two are just missing, they're gone. And then in 1945, so 9 years after that, you have Ernest Savard, who was found headless in his sleeping bag. He was another prospector who went out, went missing, search party, they found him. He's dead in his sleeping bag, no head. And then finally, in 1946, so John Patterson was another gold prospector who went missing, and this really big search party, this is getting pretty repetitive, right? Another search party goes out to look for John Patterson, and this search party was led by this really, really intense guy. I think his name was also John, but he was like hell-bent on finding John Patterson, dead or alive. And so he goes into the valley, and he would write about this. So his story is pretty unsettling. He gets into the valley. This is the search party that's looking for John Patterson. And they make camp right in the Headless Valley, so right beyond Second Canyon. They're basically where the McLeod brothers went missing. And in the middle of the night, on one of the nights they're there, they haven't found John Patterson yet. The leader of this group, who again, I think his name is John, he's just sitting there, with the search party, which is pretty significant. And out of the tree line, somewhere behind him, this man comes out wearing a cloak. And he's like a native. He looks like a Native American who just came out of the woods. And for whatever reason, John didn't feel alarmed. He just looked at this guy. The guy walks up to him and he tells John, he's like, you guys, you need to leave. You need to leave the valley. And John's like, first of all, who are you? And what's going on here? But the guy didn't give his name. He didn't say anything about who he was. He just said that there are white creatures walking around the trees right now. They're very close to you, and you need to leave. And then, before John could clarify anything, this guy turned and walked right back into the woods and just kind of vanished. And so John is totally unsettled by this. But that night, he was supposed to be in the valley for several days here looking for John Patterson. That night, after this guy came to them, John and his search party heard all these horrifying wailing sounds and these screeches and the sounds of timber falling and all this movement in the woods. And periodically, people would call out that they see something moving in the tree line that looked white, but they couldn't tell what it was. And so by the next day, when the sun came up, they abandoned the search for John Patterson and just bailed. And the leader of the search party, who again, he went in there with this bravado that he was going to find John Patterson, he said, I've never been more scared in my life, and I'll never go back inside of that valley. So John Patterson wasn't found. So from the 1905, or I should say from 1946 until now, there have been very few instances of really anything strange happening in the Nahanni Valley. But it's primarily because sometime in the early 70s, I think it was 1976, so that's mid-70s, they made the Nahanni Valley a national park. And so, we don't really know what happened from 1946 until then, but when they made it a national park, it appears to be, on the surface, if you look at it, that Canada, the government, is trying to preserve this land because it's pristine, right? But if you look at how they've positioned the park, there are certain sections of the park that are off limits to everyone, to park staff, to people, to everybody. And there is no accommodations there. It isn't like, hey, come get our brochure and check out the national park. No, they dubbed it a national park, which already makes it a protected area, but they literally blocked off sections of the park that you cannot go into. And wouldn't you know it, the parts that are all blocked off are right in or near the Headless Valley. For reasons unknown, you literally now, not just because it's difficult to get to them, but you actually can't go into them. So there's swaths of the Nahanni Valley that going into the future, nobody's allowed to go into. And some people believe the reason for that is to protect the public from whatever is inside of there. The end. So there you go. That was the Headless Valley. That's the first time I've told that live. That's a lot of info. But I think that the reason I like it so much is every one of those little bits of info, all those anecdotes, I had to sort of find them and piece them all together. And admittedly, I mean, I don't know if every one of them is absolute fact, but it's pretty telling that over several decades, there's all these just crazy stories coming out of this super remote place. So I think it's fascinating. If you want to look more into it, I'm telling you, look up the pictures of that second canyon. It might be hard to look up, but I definitely found them when we were doing the edits for this. It's fascinating. So anyways,